Hey guys, I'm coming to you live from Greece, alright? So this video, it's probably not going to be in the best quality because I am at the mercy of uploading it on roaming data. It's also probably going to cost me a pretty penny, but I really want to get my thoughts on Monster, the Ed Gein story out there. And if I was back home, I would have done a full-on video essay about this show. This is one of the biggest flops of the year for me, and I absolutely adored the Menendez miniseries that came out last year. Even the Dharma series I thought was really well done and really well executed, and both of those seasons had such an interesting story structure and played with visualization of hearsay as well as what was confirmed in a really interesting way. But here in Monster, the Ed Gein story, pretty much every single thing is an abomination, frankly. I think this is one of the worst miniseries I've watched in full in quite some time. And if it wasn't for the fact that it had the Monster label and my channel kind of got known for it last year, I'd have no interest in finishing this. I thought this was genuinely shocking. Now, occasionally some greatness will shine through. This is in, say, the performance from Charlie Hunnam as Ed Gein. I know a lot of people don't like the voice he's using. I found the voice rather interesting, all right? Like, there isn't that much known footage of how he speaks. Yes, it isn't an exact one-to-one, but I appreciate the creative flourish here. But the creative flourishes taken elsewhere in this series are genuinely insulting. It takes a lot for me to be offended and a lot for me to be like, whoa, what are we doing here? But this one really takes the cake. There is some insane characterization of real life people in this show that I just frankly had me scratching my head. And the big thing, all right, the big thing about this season and in a lot of the marketing for this season was this idea that Ed Gein is like the OG, all right? Ed Gein is what inspired Silence of the Lambs and Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Psycho, and all the marketing kind of revels in this. They have Charlie Hunnam in the posters recreating these iconic villains, these iconic horror icons, right? And they're saying, see where the story all started. So they're engaging in the spectacle, right? Don't get it twisted. And what I found weird is when you actually watch the show, yet again, it is trying to find an empathetic lens to understand the character of Ed Gein, similar to what they did with Menendez and Dharma, where it's like, okay, let's actually get to how these people are created, where the failings, where our systems went wrong to let something like this happen. For example, in Dharma, there was some empathy given to the fact that he was a loner, given to the fact that he was bullied, given to the fact that his parents abandoned him. And on top of that, there was also this intent on highlighting the way that because Dharma targeted minority groups, homosexuals, right? He had a keen focus on that kind of slipped through the cracks because the police didn't care as much as if it was, you know, rich white folk that were going missing. So my thing here is when we get to the Ed Gein story, you would expect that they would do a similar thing. And they do that. They do that at times, all right? They obviously lean into his toxic relationship with his mother, how awful his mother was. But where I think this show really slips up is they start bringing in, like Alfred Hitchcock at a certain point, they start bringing in these iconic filmmakers that made Psycho, that made Silence of the Lambs, that made Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and it feels like it's a critique on these filmmakers. They really start being like, oh, these filmmakers aren't that different to Ed Gein. There's a particular arc around Alfred Hitchcock where the show seems to be suggesting, yo, Hitchcock is actually a twisted dude himself, and he's taking advantage of this like misunderstood guy, Ed Gein, and you're like, okay, not sure I exactly get where you're going with this, but I'm going to go on the ride with you, only for then the show itself to also frame Ed Gein as a movie monster. And I just feel like you can't have it both ways. If you're going to critique Hitchcock and you're going to critique the guy that made Texas Chainsaw Massacre and you're going to talk about how Ed Gein's legacy has been misappropriated and he's someone who needed help for his schizophrenia rather than someone who was a serious monster, it's really strange to then portray him as such. And I'm trying to talk around it, but I will get into it in spoilers. But they literally fictionalize things that Ed Gein does in this show to make him appear more like these villains. It's a really strange thing to do if your point is that, like, you know, he's someone who history has kind of like been cruel to and lacked understanding around. It's a very strange thing to then frame him as the Texas Chainsaw guy. They do this multiple times. They had these extended dream sequences, and they also like fictionalize murders. There are murders that aren't confirmed or he never actually did that they just make up for this show and include for no particular reason other than to make this a more horrifying, disturbing show. But it's like, how are you going to do that and then give shit to these filmmakers? It's a really strange through line. And on top of that, they have this whole arc around Ed Gein being inspired by this famous Nazi woman who she herself also had comic books made after her. And there's some really interesting stuff in there. But some of the visualization, some of the way they communicate this stuff is genuinely bizarre. There is a scene where Ed Gein, in one of his delusions, is imagining he has this vision of a bunch of Jewish people that have escaped concentration camps, and they're coming at him and trying to invade his house like they're zombies from 28 years later. Like, you actually need to see it to believe it. I'm not making this up. I felt like I was watching a fever dream. That's the big thing with this show. So much of it should be horrifying, all right? You're watching objectively really demented, really disturbing stuff, but it has no punch. And that's my big thing with this show, is like, there's just no bite to it. Like, you're watching horrific stuff. You're watching Ed Gein, play with, removed body parts and dress in the skin of other people and try and become a woman in this really, really strange, disturbing way. But frankly, the show's presentation throughout this show is just so sledgehammer to the teeth. And after a while, I don't have any teeth left. You get what I mean? Like, you've knocked them all out in the first hour. And, let's talk about it, right? If you want to portray Ed Gein as this lonely recluse that, like, the system failed, this product of someone whose family was cruel to him and was then left all alone and then went kind of nuts. That's a really interesting angle to take. But we never feel this loneliness. In the back end of the show, they really start talking about how he was failed and he had mental illness, and maybe he was just this loner that needed a friend. But it's like, we barely see any of that. The show opens promisingly enough in this scene where he's at like a cafe and tries chatting up these two ladies, and they kind of leave him because he's a bit of a freak. He's a bit of an off-kilter dude, and that's because of the mummy issues he has with his mother, who we will talk about later. But aside from that, Ed Gein in this show is constantly surrounded by women that want to bonk him. All right, like there's multiple arcs around women that want to sleep with him, and he's not so sure. They introduced this character of Adeline, who, yes, was a real person, but they've clearly beefed up and fictionalized a lot of her involvement with Ed Gein, and I think that's a strange choice. I don't mind her being here for a bit, but she's here pretty much throughout the entire runtime of the show, and it really muddles the portrayal of what should have been a loner, so we understood how this guy got there. As it stands, like, he's actually in very good company a lot of the time. You never really feel him being particularly lonely up until the last two episodes, where I think this show actually peaks for a moment. Not the last episode. The last episode is a total abomination. But the second last episode, where Ed Gein is in an institution, is kind of what I wanted the show to be. This quiet, introspective character study where we really get an insight into his psyche. But the rest of the show, man, is just full of obnoxious, silly sequences, bad characterization, and on top of that, frankly, a really weird prioritization. I barely feel like I know Ed Gein any more than I did before watching the show. And you know what? If you're going to fictionalize stuff that makes him an interesting character to follow, I feel like Charlie Hunnam's performance is completely wasted. Aside from some really interesting physical performance stuff where he's like, practically butt naked and dancing around in other women's skin and other women's clothing and all that stuff, all the physical performance, it's very like Joker-esque, after he kills people, he'll dance. It feels a little like that. And when that is working, it's really, really working. All the gore and the grotesque practical stuff is really well done, but it's a character study that is way more interested in studying characters that, frankly, I don't think the audience cares about. We spend so much time exploring this Nazi woman played by Vicky Krieps from Phantom Thread in a role that I think must be very confusing for her to have performed. But even as an audience member, I was frankly really confused. There are long extended sections where she's portrayed as like a real tangible character that Ed Gein is inspired by or trying to interact with, whatever. And then later you'll find out that's his imagination of her, his delusion of her. And you're like, oh, okay, I would have liked to have known that before, but sure, I'll rock with that. Everything we saw was this like schizophrenic man's perception of what she was. But then later, after that reveal is done, you'll have sections that are actually meant to be real, tangible, real world stuff. The communication in this show is frankly completely muddled and messy, and not in a good way. I feel like if this show really went for it, the whole thing would have been interpretive. We would have been sitting there afterwards going, oh, is that true? Oh, was that in his head? Who knows? Let's discuss. Similar to the way that people really resonated with Joker, talk about Joker, or maybe Beau is Afraid. But in Ed Gein, in Monster, the Ed Gein story, I found my issue was they actually clarify at a certain point what is in his head and what isn't. And that I found a really strange choice, because then it's like, okay, so why are we spending time with this real person that we know nothing about? And previous characterization was actually in his head. Why are we doing that? And also, if you hadn't clarified what was a dream or what wasn't, I think people would be less mad about the stuff they're fictionalizing, because you could have gone, oh, well, that was in his head. But because at a certain point they start clarifying what was in his head, the stuff they make up feels way more insulting, because you can't give it that excuse anymore. For example, obviously Ed Gein does, unalive people at a certain point. That's what the show is about. One of the people he unalives is someone that, according to this show, they make up that he has like a intense, horny, physical relationship with, which isn't substantiated, isn't real. And again, if they wanted to chalk this up to his wild imagination, this was all a fantasy that he imagined, they could have clarified that when they clarified everything else that was in his head, but they don't. So as it stands, a lot of people are going to watch this show and leave it going, oh, he actually had like a consensual relationship with this older woman. Oh, he actually helped lead to the capturing of Ted Bundy. Dude, what are we talking about? There's a scene later, institutionalized. And by the way, this show has major MCU vibes. And I will get into full spoilers, but so far, anything I've said, I don't think massively spoils the show. But when I'm going to get into spoilers, I'll let you know. But there are sections that feel like MCU, and they did that in Dharma. My least favorite part of Dharma was that moment where they gave a random cold open to John Wayne Gacy, and previously a show about, murder, where the murders were actually framed as tragedies and really off-putting and gross and hard to watch. They have a cameo from John Wayne Gacy where they frame him like a fucking superhero, frankly, and I found it really insulting and gross, and it felt really, for a show that felt like kind of respectful at times, really, really disrespectful. And, they just couldn't help themselves. But with Ed Gein, they turn that up to like 11, all right? They just constantly make up like, oh, Ed Gein inspired this person, and this person called Ed Gein, and this person was in jail talking to Ed Gein, and then the Mindhunter people show up like a fucking DC crossover in the last episode, and they get actors that remind you of the fictional portrayals that were in Mindhunter, the adaptation version. So they don't get like, it's just so strange and so muddled. And you're just sitting there being like, why didn't we just have a good characterization of Ed Gein? Why are we spending so much time on all this random bullshit? And all of it is turned up to 11. At the back end of this show, they introduced this person, a real life person who killed a bunch of nurses, right? And now they're going through the process of transitioning to a woman. And I read up on this, and that is actually substantiated. This person did start taking estrogen, but in this, they have giant like knockers. And I'm like, how did this happen? How did the surgery, like what's going on? Do you know what I mean? Like, when did this surgery happen? And I was like Googling it, and I'm like, okay, so they didn't go for the full operation or anything. They just started taking these hormones. But in the show, of course, they have giant knockers that there's no way could be accomplished without plastic surgery. And that kind of sums up the thing with the show, right? None of it is ever subtle. None of it is ever respectful. And none of it is ever restrained. If there was potentially someone who's taking estrogen, they need to be turned up to 11. There needs to be an unnecessarily explicit sex scene that's completely over the top, where now this person is, kind of self-hating themselves, and the person having sex with them also doesn't like them. And it's just all this stuff where it's like, you can tell that the writers are just sitting there essentially making fan fiction. You know what I mean? And I want to stress, my issue here isn't that a trans character is portrayed in this show. The whole show has been about a character questioning his sexuality. But you just get these characterizations that are so cartoonish, so lacking of depth. And it really does feel like your edgelord friend that you've been spending time with, who's into true crime, just being like, oh, do you think they ever, like fornicated with like their victims? Like, do you think that like, oh, maybe when this person that was taking estrogen was getting banged, like they actually had like some self-loathing, and like they shared that self-loathing as dirty talk? Oh, do you think the guy that played Norman like all of it is just so off? And there is an audacious moment where they start suggesting that like Alfred Hitchcock is like a worse dude than Ed Gein. And don't get it twisted. Like, I've read up on Hitchcock. I know he wasn't a particularly good dude to women on his sets, but it's just an insane parallel to be like, who's the true monster here? Ed Gein is. I'm sorry. Ed Gein is. He might be a flawed person that slowly turned into a monster, but your show has not done a good enough job of exploring any of this. But that's my big thing here. And before I get into spoilers, I have some suggestions if you enjoyed any of the seasons of Monster and were disappointed by Ed Gein and would like something, in my opinion, that does what this show should have done, all right? Does what the Ed Gein show should have done. One, I'm going to recommend Nitram. This is about the person that committed the Port Arthur massacre, all right? And the reason I like this show is it doesn't give you a birth to death story, all right? It doesn't start you at his birth and gives you this insane lore. It really is just a pocket in time leading up to the incident. But you are able to sit with this character and his loneliness and his isolation and watch how a monster is slowly formed and watch how he slips through the cracks, watch how he gets access to guns, watch how people ignore all the signs. And I think that's what Ed Gein really should have channeled into. You just never feel the loneliness and the isolation because he's constantly surrounded by ridiculous characters that we don't care about. On top of that, it's constantly kind of way to random nonsense. And this implication that like the guy that made the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, he's actually a sicko as well. Like he was imagining killing people. Blah, blah, blah. It's just insane. And there's so many moments in this show where it just goes for these big swings of like, oh, he's inspired this person and they've inspired him. And it's all just crap. It's all just crap. I'm sorry. And like the ending as well goes for this swing of like a character. It's just ridiculous. There's this moment in the show where this kid is committing a crime while in a graveyard, right? For some reason, he imagines Norman Bates watching over him, and then Norman Bates turns into this vision or this ghost, whatever it is, turns into Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs, and then turns into Leatherface, and then the ghost or vision of Leatherface chases him, and then the mask gets taken off and it's Ed Gein and he starts dancing with a chainsaw into the night. And there's so much wrong with this scene. Why is this kid having this random vision of the show's thesis, right? Like that's the big thing with this show. It will constantly do things for characters where it's like, well, that's only for the audience. Like, why is this kid randomly having this vision that sums up, oh, like all these monsters are connected? Like he's a random kid. How does he know this? He doesn't have the internet. Like what? What are you doing? And then on top of that, after the kids left the scene, that vision or ghost or whatever is still there and then turns back into Ed Gein and he starts dancing with the chainsaw. So it's like, was the message of the show that Hollywood misappropriated his story, or was the message of the show that he's fucking awesome because he inspired all these icons? And I just, the messaging of this show is just baffling. Now we're going to get into spoilers. We're going to go character by character. 3, 2, 1. Hey guys, if you're enjoying this video, please consider getting a membership to this channel. Links in the description are below for both Patreon and YouTube memberships. For the cost of a cup of coffee a month, you get access to a podcast every week or two where I talk about every single thing I've watched, both shows and movies, both new and old, so cinema releases, anything that I've just watched in my spare time that isn't covered on the channel. And yeah, it really helps out the channel, so please consider signing up in the links below. Thank you so much. Now back to the video. All right, so now we're going to get into a full spoiler talk. Let's talk about Charlie Hunnam as Ed Gein. All right, so as I said, I like the portrayal. First off, he kills his brother way too early. This is a really interesting idea, all right? And this is part of fictionalization that I don't hate, right? This is a rumor. This is something where in real life, his brother did have slight suspicious circumstances around his death. And now that, you know, this guy's outed as a murderer, it is kind of interesting to think about. So I didn't hate them leaning into this. What I hated was like, we barely got any time with him. We got that, like that relationship was not set up well at all. We didn't care when he killed the brother. I just felt like this show went from 0 to 100 way too quickly. Like the mum dying should have been the midpoint of the show. The brother dying should have been the midpoint of the show. We should have spent time with him being rejected by women. We should have spent time with him, you know, being shamed. But the way the information is delivered compared to like Menendez and Dahmer is really clunky. It's not satisfying in a way where you find things out later and you go, nice. It's just awful. Frankly, it's awful. We spend no time with the brother. So we just don't really care. We spend no time with any of these characters before shit hits the fan. And it's a completely baffling choice, especially given the fact that later in the show, we spend so much time with fucking Adeline, who is shocking. Anyways, moving forward with Ed Gein's character, I did really like the exploration. Probably my favorite thing was the exploration of his relationship with his gender, his sexuality, all of that stuff, I actually thought was really interesting. I thought the conversations with the therapist were really good as well. But again, that scene with the therapist where the therapist kind of like starts speaking like the writer was really strange to me, all right? And it's not that I disagree with the messaging, all right? I've actually heard this argument before, this idea that transgender women or transgender people in general are often framed as devious, as villains. They become these icons in horror. And it feels like the writer is trying to like set the record straight and kind of correct that and be like they're often mischaracterized and oftentimes are actually the victims. The issue is it just makes no sense for this doctor to be that passionate in this time period, given who the doctor is, given how dispassionate he is in general. Like, it just feels like a really strange moment where the writer is taking the gear sticks, and it just would have been more appropriate coming from a different character. But it was really clunky. And I know technically that dialogue is coming from the transgender woman that Ed Gein looks up to and is talking to on the ham radio, but it's later revealed that that conversation is actually just with the therapist. So as I was saying, it's the therapist saying it, and it just feels a bit clunky. And there are so many moments throughout this show where it'll just be beating you over the head with the message. This is the most obnoxious show in terms of like name dropping its title. Like, consistently there'll be characters being like, you're not a monster, Ed. You just misunderstood. Maybe Hitchcock's the true monster. Maybe they're the true monsters. You're not the true monster. What is a monster? Is it born or created? I'm going to say it. I don't think this whole like nature versus nurture thing is that exciting of an idea, especially when it's explored in this much simplicity, like, or with this much simplicity, sorry. Like, I actually think this is like baby's first philosophy. I'm so sorry. Like, every season that comes out, Ryan Murphy's on the press kit being like, you know, like, it's just interesting. Like, who's the real monster? It's like, yeah, probably the person killing a bunch of people. I'm sorry. Like, like, do you know what I mean? Like, yeah, we can acknowledge some of the things that go wrong here and some of the things that build this up. And I think you could actually make a case for Ed Gein being the most empathetic out of all three series, right? But the show doesn't do a good job of actually getting that across, because the show like fictionalizes all these murders, all these fantasies, portrays him as a violent guy, which again just feels so strange when they're constantly critiquing these other filmmakers, and then they have the goal to be like, who's the real monster? Is he just misunderstood? I'm like, you're not helping. You're not helping by making up these murders that happen in the woods with these random guys, like confirming the idea that he killed his brother, and having the marketing material look like this, and then having these moments where he's running around with a giant chainsaw and killing people just to like pull the rug from under you. And on top of that, yeah, the fictionalization gets worse. We get this insane MCU cameo from Ted Bundy, which I will give credit to. The filmmaking's visceral and very nasty, but given the rest of the tone of the show, it feels almost too nasty, if that makes sense. Like, if this was like a 90-minute movie, I'd be like, okay, like that's what it's going for. But it feels really strange to, I guess, try have empathy at times and then have this portrayal of Ted Bundy just be so ruthless. Now, Ted Bundy is a monster. That's not my issue. I just find it's the same thing with the John Wayne Gacy thing. A show that's interested in seemingly unpacking the complications around these characters randomly brings in another murderer just to revel in murder scenes, and I find it really off-putting. This is the second time they've done it. But more to the point, we have this whole extended like Mindhunter cameo. We have all like this rogues gallery of serial killers show up, and it's just so obnoxious. And then, yeah, we have the Mindhunter cameo, and then they suggest that like Ed Gein actually helped catch Ted Bundy. And again, this is where we get into it. Like, there's no moment where they clarify this is just a fantasy or a delusion he's having. And again, like, there could have been a case to say like, oh, like the whole point of the show is what's in his head, what isn't in his head, because he's schizophrenic. But if you're going to do that, you can't really sit here and do the thing where you clarify what was imaginary, what wasn't, with that whole ham radio section. Because now we have tangible, like we have in-universe evidence of what was fictional and what wasn't. So it's like you've kind of broken that, you know? Now, I will say I did like all the ham radio stuff. I actually thought that, and we should have had that throughout the show, that was a really well done way of giving him character development. And it is just him in isolation. Yes, he's talking to this Nazi woman and he's talking to the transgender woman, but you know, like the ideas here are actually really solid. The idea that he's unpacking his own sense of guilt and responsibility with parts of his subconscious while thinking he's talking to other people or talking to his therapist is a really interesting concept. It's a really well done idea. But again, this happens on episode 7 of an 8-episode show. All of this stuff with him in the institution was genuinely fantastic. It's what I wanted the show to be pretty much the whole time. This lonely, isolated character study. You know, we actually start building him up as a character in an interesting way. I start getting a feel for the way he kind of ticks. And it's also kind of subtle at times, but God damn, the rest of the show, we go from him killing his brother. I found the mum, I know she's like a famous actress. All right. I found his mum terrible. All right. Maybe not as a performance, but I don't think the performance was particularly that good, if I'm being honest. But more so to the point, I thought the writing and the characterization was just so shit. Like, I thought it was so bad. These are interesting ideas, all right? Like, mummy issues are something that I will always find fascinating. I think they're always interesting, and it's always interesting to have men that are physically imposing, physically powerful, be humbled by essentially love for mummy. It's not a new thing, but like, you know, Ed Gein is kind of part of the origin for this trope. And, you know, I'm a sucker for it. I think Beau's Afraid does it really well. But here, no. I don't think it was well done at all. We never get a sense for, like, again, like his dad leaves at a certain point. We find out his dad was abusive. We find out the brother was the last connection he had. But all of this stuff is introduced, and then we have to piece it together later, and not in a good way. You know, he kills his brother because his brother is speaking against his mum. But I just needed more time with the family unit before Ed Gein took his turn, or just more time, fly on the wall, understand Ed Gein. Let these moments sit. It wasn't shocking when he killed his brother. It wasn't shocking when his mum died. Like, all of this stuff just kept happening, and I'm like, on paper, this is horrific. But I'm not feeling anything because I don't care about any of these characters. We've just been bombarded with obnoxious filmmaking, obnoxious writing, just the most surface level, like, it's just bad. It's just bad, frankly. And it was the first time out of these like monster series where I was like, oh, rather than feeling like a really great 10-hour movie, this is the first one that frankly feels like a Netflix show. Like, go back and watch Menendez. You have Javier Bardem. His character's really well substantiated, really interesting. Chloe Sevigny's character was super well interesting. Both of those Menendez brothers are super well characterized, super interesting. You get that whole one-take episode that everyone that pretends they didn't like the rest of the show says they love that episode, but I think that episode is only earned because the rest of the season is pretty solid for the most part. And more importantly, in Menendez, the actual family unit is well defined and well done as a character. And I think you needed that approach here. I don't mind that we don't get Ed Gein from the moment he's born to the moment he dies. You know, they did that with Dharma. They're doing something different here. But if you're going to drop us in a point in time, focus on him. What was with all this Adeline stuff? Why are we getting all these arcs around Adeline? And on top of that, they start suggesting that, like, the idea to do all this stuff with women was given to him by women. There's literally a moment where Adeline goes to leave him and she's like, oh, you know, you should really find a girl. And he's like, oh, girls don't like me that much. And then she's like, oh, well, why don't you just dig up bodies? I'm like, what are we doing here? And you know what? I'm going to say it. Like, I reckon they wanted us to empathize with Ed Gein to a certain point. And I'm going to take it in an interesting direction. I still, if you were going to be able to get me to empathize with Ed Gein, I probably still could have done that if he was grave robbing. I think you actually could have not had this whole arc of like, we're going to blame all the women and his wife and like fictionalize these scenarios. I know the mum is partly to blame and we will get to that, but this whole scene with Adeline just rang really false and strange and really bizarre. But I just feel like you could have had, if you had built up his loneliness, his isolation, had multiple moments where he tries to connect with people, tries to connect with women, and they're harsh and they reject him. When he then resorts to digging up bodies just to be close to someone, I would have got it. That was something in Dharma, right? Remember Dharma? They framed it as sometimes he just wanted a friend, which was confirmed. Like, that was a real thing that he said in interviews, and he just wanted to hold them so they couldn't leave. It's like, he's doing a really fucked up thing, but there's a humanity there that I understand, and that is a bit more complicated and a bit more interesting. I think this whole thing of like, oh, we're just going to get Adeline to suggest that he does this, I don't know, it's really lame, and we just never feel the loneliness and the isolation to understand him. And yeah, we spend all this time. Anyways, we'll move on. But like, yeah, I liked all the sequences of him cross-dressing, him having admiration for this famous transgender woman and trying to connect with the person in the prison. All of that stuff around his sexuality was, in my opinion, the most interesting stuff and really well done stuff. And all the conversations around it were really interesting. It was actually all the murder and the grotesque stuff that I thought was completely dead on arrival, not interesting. And his schizophrenia and the exploration of that was just way too late in the game. On top of that, there's this insane montage. There's 2 dream sequences where he meets like the rogues gallery of serial killers that all like congratulate him. And then he has another dream sequence where he meets his mother at the end. And the mother says like, wow, you really, you made the Gein name famous, like, well done. And I'm like, okay, like I can get behind this. But yeah, what I was suggesting earlier that I couldn't get behind was after he has passed away, there's a group of kids go to vandalize his grave, and this kid sees, a vision of Norman Bates into Buffalo Bill, into Leatherface. The vision of Leatherface or Ghost chases him, but the issue is then the kid leaves the scene. And the vision, I guess, is a ghost because it acts with autonomy outside of the kid, right? The kid's gone, and Leatherface takes off his mask, and it's Ed Gein dancing into the night with a chainsaw. I'm like, what are you getting at here? How are you complaining about how he's been characterized? Like, unless they're suggesting like this is the idea of Ed Gein we have in the public consciousness existing forever. But it's like, I don't know, give me a break, man. Do you want to be any more pretentious? Like, I don't think the show has earned this level of like interesting discussion. And I think it's a waste of opportunity. I think we really could have had a fantastic show that leans into, this is what it looks like when someone is clearly mentally ill, clearly schizophrenic, before a time where people could help him, and slowly slips through the cracks. But we just got, frankly, a giant turd. And I think a waste of Charlie Hunnam's pretty great performance. And, I don't even mind. I actually think, like, look, I searched up Ed Gein photos. People kept saying, like, oh, they've made him too hot. I searched up Ed Gein photos. I thought Ed Gein was like a decent looking dude. I don't think this is that much of a leap. I will say, though, Charlie Hunnam talked about how, like, oh, I really had to lose a lot of weight and get super skinny for this portrayal. He looks like a fitness model. This doesn't look like someone who, like, actually just, like, lost a lot of weight and really, like, not even leaned down, like just got skinny and a bit emaciated. This looks like someone who's shredding for stereo. This looks like someone who's shredding for a bodybuilding contest. Like, this looks like someone who was having a gram of protein per pound of body weight while, drinking his Cellucor. Like, it's ridiculous. Anyways, moving on. So next character we have is Augusta. And I don't mind, like, if it's true to life that Augusta was literally, this is his mum, by the way. If it's true to life that Augusta was never kind, I don't mind this one-dimensional portrayal. But my issue is, like, we never get any quiet scenes with her or any scenes where any of the manipulation is subtle or just, it's all at an 11 out of 10. And as a result, I never connect with this stuff. Like, yes, like toxic boy mums are awful. And some of the stuff she does is really horrific. There's, she shames, and this is stuff that happens often. Like, you will hear about this. A lot of people that go on to commit crimes have these similar complexes with their mum. But you have all these arcs around how the mum shames him for his sexuality, shames him and his like body, like his body parts. She wanted a daughter. All of that stuff is horrific. But I just wish we got more time with it, like, and good time with it. Not this like over the top, obnoxious, silly performance that Laurie Metcalf is giving. I thought all the scenes together were just shocking, frankly. Really bad, cartoonish. That's it. Cartoonish. Lacking depth, lacking subtlety, just loud and obnoxious. And it's like, again, if you gave your 15-year-old edgelord friend the script or the idea and we're like, hey, I'm going to give you some ideas about, she's shaming him for touching himself. She's shaming him for like his private parts. She's shaming him because he's a man and she wanted a daughter. Write me some stuff around that. And your 15-year-old edgelord friend, this is what he'd give you. It's fucking trash, man. And again, I want to stress, I have no issue with the content. I like dark stuff. I love a good exploration of mummy issues. But again, check out Nitram, because I thought this sucked. Next, we have Susanna Sun, who I did actually really like her performance in The Idol. She is playing Adeline Watkins. Look, I think she gives a really good performance. I think there's some interesting stuff when she wants to sleep with Ed and he's not ready to do that because of his mummy issues. All that stuff's good. As the show goes on, they start suggesting that she was like Lady Macbeth and kind of like manipulating Ed Gein, which I'm a little less hot on, as I mentioned before, but I'm like, fine, whatever. The big issue I have here is when she leaves the story, the show seems to go like, oh yeah, nah, everyone's interested in following her character. Dude, fuck off. There's this whole exploration. They suggest that she's really into morbid stuff. I think she's meant to represent notably this influx of like girly girls that are really into true crime. It's kind of like the quirkification of true crime, right? That's kind of like an epidemic we've seen with finding all these murderers hot, particularly normally with a female audience. It even happened with Menendez. So it feels like there's almost some of that in here, but she's obsessed with morbid stuff. She introduces Ed Gein to these Nazi comics and this horrific Holocaust photography. And I will say, I did actually like, I should have mentioned this in the Ed Gein section, I did like some of the visualizations of the Holocaust. I thought they were actually pretty confronting, horrific, and well done set design. But again, the 28 years later Jewish stampede was definitely a choice. But yeah, with Susanna Sun as Adeline Watkins' character, there's this whole section where she starts trying to get a job with or become the assistant of the photographer of those awful photos. And it's like, who gives a fuck? What are we doing? Get back to it. And then I think she like beats, like that's the thing with this show. It throws so much at the wall that you forget stuff and you're like, wait, that happened. I'm pretty sure it shows her like beating a woman to death with a shoe because she, fumbled the meeting for her or something. Like, what the fuck? Anyway, just crap. Then we have, oh my God, I can't believe I didn't talk about this in the spoiler free. We have Tom Hollander as Alfred Hitchcock. A terrible prosthetic job. Doesn't look anything like Alfred Hitchcock. I don't mind if it doesn't look like Alfred Hitchcock if they don't try to. But, I'm someone who I care more in biopics about good performances and embodying the spirit of the character than I do, oh, it looks like him. Like when people look at like biopic casting and they're like, oh, it looks exactly like him. This is going to be good. I'm like, is it a good actor? Who gives a fuck? In this one, doesn't look anything like him, which I don't hate. But the prosthetics, they try to make him look like him. And it's absolutely atrocious. And on top of that, the performance sucks. I know Tom Hollander is like a good actor. He's terrible here. The writing, terrible. This whole conversation they have of like, Ed Gein isn't really a monster. They have all these moments where he's like peeping and looking at, women, like his female co-stars or his female actresses, directly lining it up with what Ed Gein's doing. And I'm like, you're not as smart as you think you are. Like, I'm so sorry. And I'm not offended that they're leaning into the shortcomings of Alfred Hitchcock, but I just thought all of this stuff was frankly trash. Frankly, dumb schlock trash. And there's a moment where really strange, right? Because they show Ed Gein dressed up as Norman Bates, or Norman Bates dressed up his mum, but they put Ed Gein in the famous Psycho scene, and then they add all this excessive gore, which feels like a strange tribute to Hitchcock, because in Hitchcock you don't see all this gore, but in this one we see like horrific gore. And again, if it wasn't for the context, I would really admire this scene and how gory and confronting it was, but because it's meant to be a recreation of Psycho, it just feels dumb. It's like, why are you doing this? But they put Ed Gein in this scene, but it's like, why? I don't understand. Like, what are you showing? And it tricks the audience because we actually think, oh, did Ed Gein just kill his girlfriend? And then turns out he doesn't. So it's a delusion of Ed Gein. He's imagining doing this, but it's like, why is he imagining something that happened in a movie later? So then maybe you can make the argument that this is Alfred Hitchcock imagining Ed Gein doing this while making the movie. But then later on, so it's to trick the audience, but then later on Ed Gein goes, oh my God, you're alive. I thought you were dead, which is only for the audience because it's like, okay, if it's Hitchcock's vision of Ed Gein doing this, then Ed Gein didn't have that vision and therefore he wouldn't think his girlfriend's dead. But then he thinks his girlfriend's dead because he's like, oh, you're alive. And I'm like, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? Like, was I meant to take that as, yeah, Hitchcock's vision, or was I meant to take that as Ed Gein imagining killing his girlfriend? Because initially I was like, oh, Ed Gein killed his girlfriend. Oh, no, he didn't. Oh, okay, that was Hitchcock's vision. Oh, no, it wasn't, because now Ed Gein is referencing it and going, oh, you're alive. What do we do? Like, this is the thing where the show just has no clue, like, what it's doing, frankly. It feels incompetent. And like, yeah, I wish I could just turn my brain off and not care. Again, maybe it's going for like a Beau is Afraid, like reality and fiction and dreams, all of it's blending together, but like, give me a break. Next, we have Olivia Williams as Alma Reveal. Why is Netflix listing this as main character? Okay, next we kind of get interesting. We have Vicky Krabs from our Vantum thread as Ilsa Koch. This is the Nazi woman. This is kind of interesting. A lot of the characterization, I read this in an interview, but a lot of the scenes here are actually meant to be fantasies. Here we go. All right. According to this, she only appears in Gein's fantasies. This is according to the Netflix website. But that doesn't check out because there are scenes here when he's not fantasizing her that are just filling us in on what happened to her. That whole scene where, after Ed Gein confirms with the therapist that he was imagining talking to her, we then have this scene where she imagines this Jewish myth, this Jewish monster coming to get her. We also have the scene where her baby's taken away from her. I don't think all of this is actually, I think simultaneously a lot of it is fantasy sequences, right? All the early stuff is fantasy sequences. It's Ed Gein's imagination of her. That's fine. But then they also have scenes that are just telling us what happened to Elsa Koch. And I'm like, why? Why muddy the waters even further, And why, unless Ed Gein's imagining for some reason that she had this vision of this Jewish myth, this Jewish monster that torments her, which I didn't hate the scene. But yeah, there's this really bizarre scene where Ed Gein is having sex with a woman and imagines that Elsa is calling to him while she's having sex. And it's almost, if it was in a better show, I would have been like, oh, it's suggesting this eternal transcendent connection that they have, almost subconsciously. But as it stands, it's probably just more vague. Is it a dream? Is it not? Who knows? And it's just like, a bit whatever in my opinion. But I did like all the visualizations, and I actually thought the scenes where it felt like it wasn't necessarily his imagination, it was just like, here's what she was like in prison, were interesting. But yeah, there's this scene where she starts talking to Ed, and it's his imagination. It's his delusion talking to the therapist, I think, or it's just his delusion in general, one or the other. But she starts talking about how he isn't a monster and she's mischaracterized as a monster. And this stuff's interesting, right? Because it's Ed Gein imagining what she would say about herself, what she would say about him. Interesting, good stuff. But yeah, the muddy of the waters of, is that telling us what happened to her? Because I had to check. I'm like, okay, is he imagining that a baby got taken from her? If this is all in his head? Oh no, it didn't. That actually happened. Oh, is he imagining that she died in prison? Oh no, he isn't imagining that. So even though a lot of this is the fantasy, like they say here, a lot of it also isn't. So it's like, why blur the lines? Next, we have a Vantum Thread cast reunion. We have Leslie Manville as Bernice Warden. This is one of the true victims of Ed Gein. And this is the fucking one where they give him a horny-ass relationship with her. Again, this is my issue, right? Less lonely. Instead of scenes that were like real life where he's just watching her from afar and, looking at her and stalking her restaurant or wherever she works, stalking her store. No, they have a full relationship where he claps her cheeks and she's like all over him and finds him a stud. And you can't really blame her. He's a good looking dude, but it's like, why? Why are we doing this? Why, instead of giving us this, can you imagine how good this show could have been if we barely got any Ed Gein dialogue? So when he spoke, you lingered on every word. And when he interacted with people, you're like, oh no, he fucked it. Why didn't we have scenes where he's reading books, imagining connecting with people? And then when he tries to talk to people, it doesn't work. But instead, he's a wizard. He's a magician because he's got this girl that really wants to sleep with him. And then he's got Leslie Manville and just, yeah, again, if this was fiction, some of this I wouldn't hate, but it's just really strange stuff. And look, I will say I thought the execution of the gore effects when she was hung upside down was really, really well done. Really, really good stuff. But at the same time, no, absolutely not. I don't know what we're doing with Leslie Manville here. Absolute shame. Next, we have Addison Rae. Now, I will say, I actually don't think Addison Rae is the world's worst actress. And I know everyone hates that remake. Was it He's All That or She's All That? Whichever one she did. I remember thinking she was okay in that. And here she's completely fine. And I think, given who she is, kind of a brave role to do. She is putting it all out there. It's a decent enough section, but not amazing. I don't think anyone's going to remember her character that much or her performance that much. But it's fine. It's just there to be like, oh, look, we got Addison Rae and it's another victim. And they have this moment yet again where Ed Gein, and this isn't the filmmaker imagining it. This is where it gets murky. We have Tim Hooper is making Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and he imagines. Okay, let me explain this. So in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, there's this famous scene where the bad guy is taunting a woman with a hammer, dropping it near her head, before attempting to murder her, schmurder her. And in this one, Ed Gein starts doing that, and it's like. So are we saying that Ed Gein's story was unfairly cartoonized or not? Because now this show is almost suggesting, no, he did literally do this, and that's where Tim Hooper got this from. And it's like, that's not confirmed. In fact, this whole babysitter section isn't confirmed and is just speculation. It's like, what are we doing here? Like, why are you simultaneously seemingly critiquing these filmmakers and then being like, oh, but like, look, like, he kind of did it. Like, look, he did the hammer thing. I'm like, what the fuck's going on? Like, am I being nitpicky or like what? Because I was just like, what? Then we have a really interesting portrayal of Anthony Perkins. So Anthony Perkins is the guy that played Norman Bates in Psycho. He's in this show, played by Joey Polari. I know that's a bit confusing, but we have an actor playing Anthony Perkins who plays Norman Bates, who's inspired by Ed Gein. And I would be really interesting to know what Osgood Perkins, the director of The Monkey and Longlegs, who is Anthony Perkins' son, makes of this. But they do spend a little bit of time on Anthony Perkins being closeted, a closeted gay man, which I know his son has talked about and is a strong part of his movies, this idea of hiding your shame from your family and not being able to be who you are. But yeah, the exploration here, it's not that I have an issue with what's exploring, but they spend a weird amount of time on it, which I don't mind, but we never see him again. So like, I was actually kind of curious around his arc of being in the closet, and then they just end it with him getting head in the cinema for Psycho or Psycho 2. What? Do you know what I mean? Like we spend like 15, 20 minutes on it. I'm like, oh, maybe this will be an interesting through line, like the guy that played a fictionalized Ed Gein reckoning with that legacy throughout the years. But no, like they just abandon that and go, yeah, he got head in the cinema, whatever. It's like, oh, like if you're going to spend that time on it and get me invested in his story of being in the closet, being this famous actor, like really go there, you know? Next, we have the character of Deputy Warden. This is the son of Bernice Warden. This is the son of Bernice Warden, and I just thought this was a dull character, frankly. I did like the section where he went to sell the goods from the house. That was fine. But no, just dull character, boring character. Him and the other cop, super boring. Like, I'm not trying to be a hater, but just not particularly good. Not particularly good. No, that's about it. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. I hope this video wasn't too sloppy. I hope you enjoyed it. I just want to get my thoughts out there. Please like, comment, and subscribe. If you enjoyed this video, please consider getting a membership like I mentioned before. Thank you so much for watching. Sorry about the quality and the setup here and the lack of clips, but thank you so much for watching. I do want to get this stuff out to my fans, and have a lovely day. Thank you.